Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
Good afternoon. Welcome to the Visiting Speaker Series. I'm so glad you are all able to join us on this record-setting beautiful day in Seattle. Our guest today is Professor David Nye from the University of Warwick, who is bouncing back and forth between many teaching and professorial and writing positions. He seems to have about 3 jobs whenever I look him up on the internet. He's written many really fascinating books on the history of technology, and I think as a historian just has a very rich perspective to bring to us about how to think about technology and some heuristics to put on thinking about technology. The book that he's here to talk to us about today is Technology Matters, in which he asks 10 pretty fascinating questions with regards to how does technology get created and how should we understand our relationship as humans with technology. I'm so pleased that he was able to come back to the States for a little bit and chat with us about this work. Please help me welcome Professor David Nye.
You don't want the other screen. Okay. Yeah. Well, thank you very much for coming on this day when I gather we're going to set all kinds of heat wave records. And I'm going to tell you a little about this book that came out a few months ago called Technology Matters. And you have not read a review of it yet, as far as it's not, for some reason, been reviewed in Britain, but not here. Nevertheless, I can tell you that it has already sold out the first printing. So somebody's reading it, and somehow somebody at Microsoft heard about it. I haven't actually found out how that happened.
It's my job.
It's your job. Anyway, so I'm very pleased to come and tell you about it. The title, it could be read 2 ways. It means technology matters in the sense that matters can be a verb, like it's really a thing that does matter. It can also be, of course, matters of technology. And it's meant to be understood in a sense both ways. But don't ignore the subtitle, Questions to Live With, because that's really the heart of what's the idea of the book, is that there are questions that are a little too big for most historians to take on. Questions which I would not, if I were starting out as a PhD student, I was going to write my PhD thesis, I would not attempt to write a book like this. I wouldn't even attempt to write a book on one of the 10 chapters because they're too big. And my advisor, or if not, now I had a student come in, I'd tell him, say, you can't do that. That's too big. You've got to do something where you can go in and there's a half a mile of research papers and books to read through. And when you come out at the other end, you'll be the world expert on, the invention of the, Hungarian eggnog or some obscure thing, But when you've paid your dues for a while, as I have, then you can start to write more broadly. So I wrote a number of books, some of which are here, and not all because they go back pretty far. But in 1986, I wrote one. In a sense, it's relevant to you here because it was started in a collaboration I had with General Electric and their research labs called Image Worlds. And it's about the construction of corporate images. That was followed by Electrifying America, American Technological Sublime, Consuming Power, and America's Second Creation. And then finally, this Technology Matters today. But that was a much broader book than the others. So the first chapter of that is, what is technology? How do people understand? What do we make sense of this? And the first thing I'd say to you is that it's not machines by themselves. Unfortunately, there's a general perception, I think probably less here, at a place where you're creating technologies, but the general public has a tendency to think, well, technologies are machines. They're steam engines or they're rockets or something. But actually, if you think about it, technologies are much older than that. They really go back very long ways. I think it's an evolutionary perspective you ought to have. You ought to think of it in terms of that the technologies that we have today, if you trace them back, ultimately you could go back to the ancient axes or the carefully made jewelry that you can find even 100,000 years ago. I just read in the paper that they've found now some early jewelry for 100,000 years old. So that the technologies are there very early on, and they involve thinking in time, because you don't find animals using tools. Animals, except maybe with a few exceptions of a few examples we seem to have of chimpanzees and a few of the other primates. But basically, you have to think in time. That you have to say, I'm going to get a device, or maybe a stick, for example. You're just going to reach something and pull it toward you that you can't reach otherwise. You have to think in time. You have to say, well, I want to get this thing over here, and I have to have a device of some kind to get this thing from one place to the other. And it seems very simple when I say that, but actually most creatures don't do this. They don't think in time. They think just in the present. And of course, the more you think in time, the longer the perspective may get. So if you are chipping out an arrowhead, it's not with the notion that, there is an animal I would like to kill right in front of me. I'll start chipping the arrowhead. It's too late, obviously. You had to chip it out way in advance. You had to have a whole stockpile of these things so that when the time came, you would have them. So you're thinking in time. That may seem like a small point, but I don't think it is. It really is the key to what technology is about. If you don't think in time, if you don't have a present, past, future orientation, if you can't think in those three dimensions, you're just not going to do it, because you have to have a memory as well. You've got to remember what the technology was for, how it worked, how you could make it better. All those kinds of things got to be there before you're going to start to chip out the arrowheads or do other things. So that the tool comes before text. Now this may seem a small point again, but I think it's important to realize that people had tools, and it's very hard to think of a society or a culture that's pre-technological. You can think of, and it's very easy to function as a pre-literate culture. There are many examples we know of that, but there are no examples that we know of a pre-technological culture. That if you think of technologies including such things as making arrowheads or other kinds of tools, or having things like tents or snowshoes, or the Native Americans, for example, had a rather rich technological life. And then the tools themselves become what I would say is the mother of necessity. It's not that necessity is the mother of invention. I think it's just the other way around. We get an ensemble of tools when we are born into a culture, and we start to play with these things. We start to think of new ways to use them. So that the real way around, in many, many cases, is that the technology is the mother of the invention rather than the other way around. Think of the way that the internet has functioned. When it was first developed as ARPANET by the military back in the 60s and early 70s, they didn't think of Amazon.com. They didn't think of Napster, stuff like this. I mean, this wasn't in anyone's mind. It was once the tool is there, people invent new uses that nobody foresaw. And you can trace that as far back as you'd like. But I'll give you another example. When Thomas Edison invented the phonograph, in order to get his patent, he had to list all the applications and uses of that phonograph. Go back and look at the patent, you'll find out that he had a whole lot of ideas of what it could be used for, almost all of which were totally irrelevant. Almost all of which had no real, he thought, well, people will dictate letters and they will send these things through the mail. People will get their grandfather to talk, and then they'll save that for future generations. I've tried this on students, 100 students in a class. I say, how many of you have heard your grandfather or great-grandfather on the phonograph? They'll look at me like I'm crazy. The point is that what was it used for? It was music was the big use. That was number 15 on Edison's list, and he said it could be a musical instrument. That was, so the tool comes first, and then people find out what they can do with it. And I could give a whole lecture just on that subject alone. The last thing I want to say about what is technology is the definition has been changing. It's not a very old word in English. It came into English as a written, as a word that, not from, it exists in a few Latin forms, but it basically is an English term only in 1832. And I've done literature searches and tried to figure this out. As far as I can tell, nobody uses it until 1832, and it's just one guy, a professor at Harvard named Jacob Bigelow. And for the next 10 years, the only person who uses it is still Jacob Bigelow. He keeps sort of hammering away on this, and gradually people start to pick it up, and you get things like Massachusetts Institute of Technology, founded with that term in there. But nobody has the modern sense of technology. This is a pretty big term for us today. Back then, when they talk about what we would say technology today, they talk about the practical arts, things like that. So it's a fairly new term. And again, we could talk a long time about it, but all I want to say is the definition has been changing, and our sense of the term actually doesn't develop until the early 20th century. It's a fairly new term. We're still, in a sense, we didn't have a good name for what this is, this technology. And in recent years, to my distress, I don't know if it doesn't distress you because you work for Microsoft, but it tends to get defined as being only computers, which I think is a very limited and unfortunate use of the term, but I understand that they talk about technology stocks. They're talking about flint, from the Stone Age. They're talking about cell phones. They're talking about this here. Yeah.
Is this patent of Edison, is it a statement about how Edison thought about it, or is it a statement how he writes patents, figuring claims 15 is just as good to sue on as claim 1?
Oh, I'm sure that you're right. He claimed as much as possible. But even after he got the patent, he didn't develop the musical side at all. It was developed by other people. It took 15 years before it really started to be used to make music. So you could follow it out in hours after. You're right. Of course, you list everything you can think of. Good point. One last little example. This is a technology of a sort. The creation of Stonehenge required enormous amount of technological skill. You had to have levers and ropes and rollers, and you had to be able to chisel the rock out and shape it. And you could just imagine the kind of technological sophistication. Although maybe you don't have electric motors and things, but they had a lot of, and also they had to do all these astronomical observations, and there wasn't any immediate payoff. So my point with this last image here is that this is an example of technology from thousands of years ago that already has gone way beyond just being practical. It's all tied up with theology and ideas of the universe and trying to make sense out of the summer solstice and things like this. And it's not anymore just a practical or functional thing. So right from very early times, you could say that technology has got a kind of a spiritual dimension for people, which I explore at some length in one of the books that is on the table over here if you want to look at it after. It's called American Technological Sublime. The second chapter of the book, after trying to get us to this question about definitions, is technology deterministic? And there's a famous line that some of you may have heard. This Ralph Waldo Emerson wrote back in the middle of the 19th century, "Things are in the saddle and they ride mankind." And that's a fairly succinct formulation of this deterministic idea. This is a very widespread notion, probably not at Microsoft, but certainly in the general population. A lot of ordinary people think that technology is somehow in control, or that they don't really have much choice, that it's sort of forced upon them. But I'll give you a couple of counterexamples from historical evidence. One is the gun. Most people think, well, once you introduce the gun into a society, there's no turning back. You can't get rid of the gun. But the Japanese did that. It was introduced in what we would call the Renaissance. They had the gun for long enough to learn how to make them, long enough to win battles with guns. And then the samurai class said, this is not really a very classy way to do combat. We kind of like the old hand-to-hand swords and arrows and, sort of more, manly arts kind of thing. So they got rid of it. As a class, they just said, we're not going to do that. This is a very interesting example, and only in the late 19th century does Japan take up the gun again. So it is possible. It's not very common, but it is possible. And my point with that example, or the next one about the wheel, is that people don't have to adopt the technology. They may or they may not. And there's a tendency, unfortunately, most people tend to think, oh, it's obviously going to happen. Now, if you work for a marketing department, it's not true. Because marketing departments are all, they love to, if it was only true, they could just introduce it and they'd all buy it. But it doesn't happen that way. I'll come back to this point in a little bit. But the wheel existed in North Africa. The Romans had the wheel. And after the Roman Empire fell apart, people in North Africa started to use camels more and more. And you could say, well, that's just a cultural decline. But historians have looked into this and said, well, the camel actually had a lot of advantages in that climate. You didn't have to feed and water it as often, and it could move faster than a cart. It could ford streams, so you didn't always have to build bridges. And so in many ways, it was a superior form of transport, given the alternatives they had in, say, the 8th century or something. So the wheel is abandoned for a while. Or there's a case of the Mayans, who we know had the wheel. They used it in some religious ways, but they didn't use it for carts and things like that. They didn't seem to expand its use to other things. So it's just an example that maybe the technology is not deterministic. Of course, there are some groups like the Amish in this country that resist some technologies, but not all. They accept roller skates, for example. You see them roller skating, but they don't want some other things. I can't go into the Amish; there's not time. But it isn't deterministic. People actually do have a choice. And one of the sources of this idea that's deterministic is actually the Marxist thinking. Karl Marx, famously said, the hand mill gave you feudalism, the steam engine gave you capitalism. Later on, Lenin argued that electricity gave you socialism. That once you had full electrification, a society would, by definition, would have to become so interdependent and so linked together that it would become socialistic. And so that kind of thinking enters at that stage, on the left to become a very dominant idea, but it's also on the other side of the political spectrum. Well, I don't know where Marshall McLuhan fits in some ways. Does anybody know Marshall McLuhan anymore? Is he a lost figure? Some of us remember. He was really big in the 60s and 70s. But Negroponte, who ran the media lab at MIT, in practice, I don't think he was a determinist, but if you read that book, Being Digital, he sounds like a determinist in there. He said, well, the internet's going to be a natural force. Actually, it's going to be a natural force to, break down barriers between cultures. And it's a natural force. That's crazy. It's not a natural force, obviously. But the most egregious examples, I suppose, would be the Tofflers. They write these books, The Third Wave, and they've got a new one out now. And Newt Gingrich is their disciple and believes everything that they write, apparently. I can just tell you that from the point of view of historians of technology, this is all total nonsense. Nobody in the field reads this stuff. But it's very widespread. So that's why I have a chapter on this. Well, is it deterministic? I think not. Well, I'll come back to it. There's an alternative called soft determinism we'll come back to. But it's often visualized. It's very deep in American culture. This is a famous image that was produced widely all over the United States. 1869, they built the first railway across the United States, the Transcontinental Railway. And the railway has reached exactly to this point, and it's all civilized, and the little town is sprung into life beside the railroad. The implication of the picture and the rhetoric surrounding this time was, as soon as the railway reaches an area, as soon as it touches the area, it blossoms, as all this civilization comes in with it. Except, of course, for these people over here, the Native Americans. They've got the clouds of smoke and steam obscuring their view. They can't see the future that lies ahead in that limitless western landscape that leads right here to Seattle, actually.
They're on the wrong side of the tracks.
They're on the wrong side of the tracks, yeah. So, but in a sense, if you look at a lot of those 19th century paintings of the West, they are in a sense visualizing this thing is going to happen. That you're going to introduce the telegraph and the railroad, and this is just going to be an automatic process that's going to take place. Third chapter of the book then takes up the questions like, well, maybe it's not deterministic, but maybe it's predictable at least. And this is a very interesting area. There was a guy who got a PhD in history and somehow got hired by General Electric and worked in the research lab in public relations, but he was also the historian for the company. You don't have somebody like that here, I don't think. Is there a historian in the...
We have archivists.
You have archivists, but not a historian. Oh. How can he exist without a historian? It's amazing. People do it. Anyway, I should go back, but I'll leave it up there. But what George Weiss did was, I'll get rid of that not to distract you. He looked at, in his PhD thesis, he looked at 1,500 predictions made between 1880 and 1930. In other words, he chose a date far enough back so there'd be some chance to look after to see if these things came true or not. And the long and the short of it is that about 1/3 of the predictions proved to be true, about 1/3 false, and 1/3 still didn't know. And so you could say that of the ones we know about, your chances seem to be about 50-50 of getting it right. And this didn't seem to matter. I mean, it could be people like Henry Ford or Thomas Edison. It could be, university professors, but he looked at, people who had made predictions that were in print, and you could, be reasonably sure that these things had really been said. And it didn't seem to matter what method they used either. In other words, they could use the method of induction, or they could say, well, we're going to graph this thing over time, we'll see how it's changing, and then we'll be able to see the tendency, that kind of thing. It didn't matter what technique they used. They all seemed to come out as a group. The group of people using different methods came out roughly the same. Now, for the purposes of my argument, I decided to break up technology into 3 levels. So I'll quickly put them up there. Prediction, forecast, and projection. Now, what's the difference? Well, I'm not using, in other words, the definition of an innovation that you would find in the patent office. Because I'm going to say that the prediction only involves breakthrough inventions. Like if you invented a machine that allowed you to communicate with the dead, that would be a very fundamental breakthrough. That would be, if you, something like the phonograph, that's a real fundamental new thing. If you invent an improved stylus or a better needle, that I would call an innovation rather than an invention, just for the purposes of this argument here. And then if it gets to the point where you're just making a new kind of whatever it is every year, the new car every year, well, it's a new model. It's not of course, in the advertising, it's going to be a breakthrough invention, but we all know that, well, it's kind of like the car last year. It's not really that different. Maybe there's a few new widgets on there, a few bells and whistles. But, so we could say the telegraph is a breakthrough invention, the telephone, the personal computer. They have long-term implications, and it takes a long time for them to develop. And the interesting thing is that, I go into this in detail in the book, then in all of these cases, nobody knows what the hell these things are for when they come out. The telegraph comes into existence, and the railways have right-of-ways, so they let the telegraph companies build the telegraph alongside the tracks, because that's a way to make a little extra money. They've already got the right-of-way. But they don't use the telegraph to keep track of the trains. That's not something I think of right away. It takes about 15 years. They have to have a certain number of accidents. And then they start to realize, they say, if we'd only sent a telegraphic message, we would have known that there were 2 trains on that track. The train wasn't where it was supposed to be. But for 15 years after the telegraph's actually running alongside on various lines, they don't, even as late as 1872 in the Boston and Maine Railway, they just ran by the book. In other words, they had a list that you were supposed to be in this town at this time. So if you weren't there, nobody knew. So the telegraph takes a while to figure it out. The first year after they build the first line from Washington to Baltimore, most of the time it's not being used. And Morse is sort of trying to drum up business. He's getting chess players in each town to play each other to kind of get people excited. Telephones the same way. Alexander Graham Bell cannot sell the He's eager to move on and be a great inventor and do other things. The telegraph company, which is now well established in a big industry, they don't see any point to it. They hire Edison and a few others to see, can't you infringe this? Can't you invent something that's very similar but not the same? And we'll have that in our, our package of stuff in case we need it, but they don't feel it's worth buying. So he has to do it himself. Personal computer, I've talked to several people who saw personal computers at MIT when they were first being invented, and they were put together, as a group to sort of like, well, what could you use this thing for? And they really didn't see. They said, well, maybe shut-ins, maybe people who can't get out, might be something for them, They didn't see what this was for. And that this is the case over and over again with these breakthrough inventions. It takes 10, 15 years sometimes. I already told you about the phonograph. The musical uses of the phonograph are not obvious to anybody from 1877 to 1891, 92. Takes a while. Innovations. Something like a new filament for the electric light would be a good example, or the automated switchboard for the telephone, or once you get the possibility of, doing something with, recording images and sound together on tape, Betamax versus VHS. And, you could talk a lot about all these examples, but I'll just say that in this case, I put down the last one because they both work, they're both good technologies. Only one of them is going to make it in the marketplace, and most people I talked to agree that Betamax was better. But it didn't win in the marketplace. So even though you get the prediction right, say, well, this is the next big thing here, we can really make money with something like this, your model might not be the one that makes it. So there's no guarantee. It's still not very predictable even when it's already invented and on the table in a sense, and you know what it's for, it still might not fly, On the other hand, people might just go for that Japanese pet rock, those Japanese,
Tamagotchi.
yes, what were they, the pet, electronic pet. I was thinking also 2 thoughts. The other one was the pet rock thing. You bought one, yeah. I know a lot of my students bought those things. But that wasn't obvious to me at least that this would work. But even when you get to the level of the new model car, it's not always predictable, because this is an old example, but the Edsel, the Ford Edsel, which they spent a large amount of money developing, and they got all these marketing people involved, and it was an absolute failure in the market. Nothing wrong with it as a car. It functioned all right, but they couldn't sell it. And that happens all the time also for extraneous reasons, that the car works well, but the price of gas just went up, just to take a hypothetical example. So is it predictable? Well, not really. Our chances, as I say, about 50-50 of getting it right. And even so, even though you got it right, it may be that the model that you come up with isn't the one that sells. And so it's not just that it's not deterministic. In a way, it's not predictable. But this shouldn't be news to people that work here, because you all know how products develop and how some of them make it and some don't. But just to remind you, a few that failed the marketplace, anybody recognize that relic of the 1990s? Yes? The Newton, or there's the Betamax, or my favorite actually, this is AT&T's phone from the late 60s, You know, you could send your image over the phone. They had the first call was made by Lady Bird Johnson. It was at the World's Fair, and you know they ever thought this is going to be the next big thing. But people just didn't want it.
Well, I mean, I would tend to disagree with you because the Newton failed, or the concept didn't.
Yeah, the concept was great.
Betamax certainly thrives
Thrives.
in the professional industry,
Yes.
not in the consumer industry.
Yeah, not the consumer.
The video phone, to be determined, right?
Yeah, yeah. But they're not. I mean, we're looking at the level now of not a fundamental breakthrough, but of the next level down. Yeah.
They people not wanted it or just couldn't get it for real because I think it needed high bandwidth lines which existed in a town
Yeah.
and a half in western Pennsylvania.
Yeah, it was partly that, but it was also rather expensive.
Yeah.
And they didn't understand the, that they could use the terminal for other things and seeing, the face of the person they're talking to. The other potential that we would see today in this kind of a device just wasn't in anybody's mind. I mean,
Probably wasn't there given how Marbell worked.
What?
I mean, Marbell was a closed system. You could use it.
Yeah.
It's not for what they wanted you to use it.
That's right, yeah. And by the way, when AT&T was offered the ARPANET, they tried to sell it to them in the mid-'70s. They said no. They didn't buy it. Anyway, just like it's just exactly the same thing as they're in the past. The Bell couldn't sell his phone to the telegraph company. Later, AT&T wouldn't buy ARPANET. They could have owned the internet. Yeah. Well, how do historians look at technology? I've given you all these examples, but now it's interesting. There's basically 4 ways to do it, and if you wanted to, or 4 ways that they tend to do this. But there's an organization, and some of you might not know about it, so I'll just say the Society for the History of Technology, which is called SHOT, and it's a very well-functioning organization. I'm not here to beg money for them. They're not broke or anything. But I think people like yourselves, if you're here for this lecture today, you might find it interesting to check it out. It's an interesting organization with all these special interest groups within it. So there's, of course, a group of people that do the history of computing within that, or there's another group that does history of electricity. But it's an international organization, and they have their journal, Technology and Culture, which we now know through the magic of the way the journals are now online. We know that it's one of the 15 most often sought out in the database for the Muse system. There's about 250 journals on there, but a lot of people are going and using it. But in any case, if you went in there, you'd find that first group of people that I'll mention, the externalists, are not there. Externalists are people who believe in technological determinism, in which the machine comes and it changes the world. That kind of argument. This thing came and nothing was the same ever again. As if the machine was like a meteor that came from outside somewhere. Now you know better. You work at Microsoft, so you know that the machine or the device comes after some years of product development. And there's a lot of struggles and a lot of definitions going on. So you might be more likely to be attracted to the internalists. Their position, essentially, they're looking over the shoulder of the research group in the past, the ones that invented something, and trying to understand how they did this and what their choices were, where the problems lay, how did they do it, what was the competition, what were the cost factors, what materials did they have trouble getting hold of, all those kinds of questions. And the internalists are incredibly valuable to me, although I don't actually work, I don't see myself doing that. A lot of them are actually former engineers or professors of physics who decide that this is an interesting thing to do. But I guess the ideal one would be one probably who got a BA or a Bachelor of Science in Engineering and then went to do his PhD in History of Technology. There are a few of those around too. But the internalists then help us establish a bedrock of facts about things. We sort of know from them what was possible and not possible, what the competition was, when something could have been made and when it couldn't have been made, and these sort of things. Then there's a group which I would say, if you had to classify me, I'd be in this group, the contextualists. Our real interest is on what happens once the thing is out there and it's starting to be sold, and how do they take this thing in. The book I wrote, not here today, but it's not surprising, it was published in 1990 now, called Electrifying America, is about the process by which people took in electricity into the home or into the factory or into transportation systems, and in each case had to make a series of choices about how to do it. And it's about the cultural construction or the contextualization of this thing, which turns out to be different from one country to the next. It's not always the same. Not every country will do it the same way, and not every country will adopt the same things. And then there's this fourth theory, which I will call soft determinism, and it might have some application in a way to Microsoft. It describes a roughly 30 to 40-year cycle when a major technology is introduced. And the key term is probably the words technological momentum. Thomas Hughes wrote a book which developed this idea, and it's a comparative study of the history of electricity in these three countries, the US, the UK, and Germany. And there are 5 stages. Now, obviously, the stages I'm giving you here for the US dates, but it'll be slightly different in other countries. But keep in mind the abstract idea of the categories themselves. Don't just think it applies only to electricity only at the end of the 19th century. Let's say the first thing is the invention and development in a few locations. That would be Edison and other people like him. But in contemporary terms, that would be people at the Defense Department and a few university laboratories setting up, it's going a little too fast here. See if we can go back. There would be people setting up the ARPANET back in the late 60s, early 70s. It was something similar to that. Then you get transfer to other regions. More and more people start to electrify. After 1882, Edison builds his Pearl Street station. He builds also a station in Holborn in London. So New York and London have it. It starts to spread from there. It transfers then to other regions. Then you get the growth of the infrastructures, production, education, consumption. Or you get schools of engineering. You get electricians. You get all the people that are involved. And he argues that's really essential. You have all that. Only then can you get technological momentum. So if you think again, the internet, well, around the early 1990s, starts about the same number of years before, in a sense, a little bit faster in these modern times, but roughly the same sequence of events. And then you get the mature stage where we are now in the case of the internet. I mean, mature in the sense that it's well developed. It's all over the place. There's still battles going on, of course, over control of various aspects of it, but it's mature in the sense of the system is up there and running and it's all over. Everybody's got it. So that you can think of this as a thing that technological momentum is not achieved immediately, but it comes after about 20 to 25 years in the case of electricity. Up to that point, architects are still designing houses with gas and electricity just in case one of them loses out, but they don't know. Fifth chapter of the book takes up this big question of homogenization or choice. Is technology making our lives more and more homogeneous and standardized? This was a real worry back in the first half of the 20th century. And the Ford automobiles are really a perfect example of what that fear was, that everything would become so standardized and identical that all differences in society be wiped out. And so the fears of standardization are embodied by Ford, but also the telephones all look the same. The old telephones are all these black desk phones for the most part. There's the black, the one on the wall, but they're made by engineers to be highly efficient machines, but they're not sold on the basis of aesthetics. There's not a new model telephone every year or something. And then Levittown, after World War II, you probably know this is a suburb that was built outside of New York, and then there were other ones, other places, but they were like identical houses. They were sometimes mocked as little boxes, and sociologists and cultural critics all said, oh, this is terrible. But if we look at this over time, there's all this differentiation. In all those three examples, the Ford car today, vastly differentiated, right? You can go in and buy any model and get different colors, different seat colors, different this, different that, all sorts of alterations. And then if you're not happy with that, you can still have more things done to it after. And so the cars are not that identical. The telephone, even better example, of course, is still developing. We're getting more and more models of phones so that I can't even make half of them work now because they're all so different. You have to read a manual. And Levittown is maybe even the best example of all because you can go back there. It's still the same houses, but over the past 50 years. Has anybody done this? Anybody ever been there? They've remodeled all the houses. They've put dormers and, second stories. They put on garages. They put on all kinds of things. And so actually it's hard to see that they're identical. You have to kind of really look to see that, oh yeah, the core, the old core of this thing is the same, but the landscaping and all the other things they do actually show that what people do with technologies is not create standard things. They want difference. That's what they want. And of course, this is not a news to people into e-marketing, right? This is something that we all have seen. Amazon's perfect example of this. They watch what books I buy, and now they think that's the only thing I'm interested in. So every time a new book of that type comes up, they're putting it on the screen, figuring maybe I'll buy it, which is good and it's bad. I mean, it's good in the sense that, yeah, they're differentiating. They're seeing me as a consumer with special interests, and so they try to appeal to those. It's bad in the sense that maybe I would get interested in the other books if I only knew what they were. But there are limits to choice, though. I don't want to present this as just a happy story. Well, actually, it's better. There's no problem with standardization. Because you could say, well, yeah, but we all have to have a car. You notice that coming out here today. In fact, I realized that maybe in theory I could have gotten a bus, but I think not really. It's almost got to the point now where you can't exist without a phone carried around. Maybe it has. I don't know. But you know, that's a development in the last few years. And so you could say there's some limits. A good example, I think, is have in the book is the food court at Ellis Island. Ellis Island represents difference, right? All the different immigrants coming in, and if you go there, they've got Chinese food, they've got Italian food, they've got all the different cuisines. You say, well, great. You know, the differences between these groups are all being preserved right here. We can see that it's not a melting pot, it's a salad bowl and all that. But I found out that all the food at Ellis Island is supplied by one company using an identical system, you know, of shipping and storage and the machinery, you know, to use to cook and the microwave and to whatever. All that stuff's the same. So you start to realize that, well, maybe there's difference on the surface, but not so much difference beneath the surface, just like Amazon in that sense. So it's a sort of a tempered thing. But I want to emphasize that all these chapters, I'm not trying to give you the final answer. I'm trying to explore the issues, lay it out for the reader and say, now what do you think? Where are we going? What are our choices? What would be the next thing? 6th chapter takes up the issue of ecological crisis or sustainable abundance, and I'll just go through this one fairly quickly. I'm sure a group like this, you know a lot about this already, but if you take Robinson Crusoe, some of you must have read that. If you haven't, it's actually a very fascinating book. I read it recently for, you know, after many years. He's a real technological guy. You know, he just reinvents all sorts of things he doesn't have on the island. And he really exemplifies this whole notion that technology is progress, that the way of understanding Western society's great virtues is through technology. That's what they can do the other people can't. So in a way, if you take that sort of 18th, 19th century view, the novel's written in the 18th century, this is about the success of technology in subduing the landscape, yielding wealth and riches and comfort without any apparent cost. I mean, there's no negative side to this. The island just yields more because he has the European tools and the European knowledge and the grains and so forth to bring with him. An alternative view, though, would be to see human beings as part of nature. Because Robinson Crusoe sees himself very much kind of coming in, he's an outsider, he's going to make this better. The humanity as part of nature argument is the sort of, then you start to think about sustainability and things of that sort. I'm going to rush through this, but the question I come down to toward the end of the book, the end of this chapter is, how many people can the Earth support? Now, your first thought might be that this should be an absolute number, that we come up with some number like, you know, 8,250,000, you know, something like that. But it turns out it's a constructed thing. That is to say, if we all decide that we must have 2 SUVs and a swimming pool and, you know, 18-room house, that's the ideal everybody's going to strive for, then obviously the Earth will support a smaller population than if it's a somewhat more modest thing. That's a very simple point, but I'm just trying to get, it isn't that there's one absolute point. It's more a negotiation. It's, again, a cultural choice. And it comes out, actually, even in Robinson Crusoe, much to my amazement, because as I hadn't read it for a long time, went back and read it. At the end, he comes back to the island, and he's settled some people there. He puts women there with these sailors that he gets to settle, and they're starting to develop the island. And then you begin to realize, well, there'll be some limit beyond which that island can't support all the people who are there. You don't know because the book ends, but you suddenly see it's now part of the world economy. It's not cut off anymore. And so the settlers suggest something else. And then if you jump ahead, fast forward to the present, Tuvalu is a little island some of you may have heard of out in the Pacific, which is now struggling with the problem that it has, on some occasions, the tide is too high, and it's literally flooding the whole island. The Maldives also have this as a threat. So there is a a kind of a time pressure on us here. We can't mess around too many more centuries trying to find out where the limits might be, because some places are going to be underwater. Some places already are. So anyway, but I present this, again, I don't have the solution. I'm just saying this is one of those questions you've got to live with. This is one of these questions we're going to have to think about. We can't afford to ignore it. CO2 emissions suggest where the U.S. is on this problem. This is not news to you, I suppose, but it helps to put the other industrial countries, which have roughly the same level of, the same standard of living as ourselves, and you can see that they're managing somehow without quite so many emissions. Or as this cartoon suggests, you know, the International Conference on Global Warming, the U.S. is in a sense represented by the SUV. Well, next chapter, I take up the question of work. And there's a fascinating story here. Some of you are old enough, as I am, to remember that the talk in the 50s and early 60s was that work was going to disappear. Hard to believe, but this was seriously thought about. I mean, they had the Congress of the United States holding hearings, labor unions issuing warnings. This was a great danger, that there would be an end to work. Everybody was going to have leisure time, and the problem of the future. I remember reading that by the time I reached the age I am now, that I would only have to work a 20-hour week, because they were just extrapolating. They said, well, we started with 12-hour days, I mean, you know, in the 1840s in factories, and it kept going down, and it gotten to the 8-hour day by the 1930s, and they were just extrapolating. So, well, you know, it's going to keep going down, and people won't be working very much. But something funny happened, as you all know, sometime in the late 60s, early 70s, people started working more again. And now the average American works about a month longer in a year, a month extra 40-hour weeks than they did in 1968. And so the question really becomes, why are we having these longer hours? The union response hasn't been very strong. As we know, unions are not too strong in the United States. So except for very special sectors of the economy where they're strong, the unions are not having a major impact as they did before. Unions helped to force down the number of hours. And unions now, many of them see themselves as part of management. I'm not saying it's a good or a bad thing. It's just the way it is. At Harley-Davidson, they see themselves as part of the value-adding potential of the company. They share offices with management. The union and the management of the company in the same floor of the same building. So the union is not, you know, there's not this big critical mass of workers who are forcing the things to change in one direction. One danger, of course, is we'll have a lot of what are sometimes called mech jobs, you know, the McDonald's type repetitive low salary employment. But these longer hours for them, of course, are because, then if you take that approach, you say, well, it's all because they don't get paid enough, so they're going to have to work long hours just to make enough to live, because the American minimum wage is about half the cost, or half the labor costs in a country like Germany. Of course, you could say also the Germans have a problem because they have to outsource all their work now to the Far East because it's too expensive. So there's a real problem here. But there's that Mac job side to it. Then there's another side to it. A lot of people are working longer and longer hours, not because they're absolutely forced to, but because they want more stuff, to put it in a real complicated academic terminology. They want more stuff, you know. They want to keep getting bigger and bigger TV sets and better cell phones and newer computers. And this stuff is all expensive. And not only that, but it all has a very short shelf life. That is, it's not like investing in a house where the value will increase, we hope, where we know when we buy a car or a computer that in 10 years' time this thing is going to be pretty much worthless. So that's another reason. Another reason that people work hard, and this would apply to the people in this room, you belong to what many sociologists would call the symbolic analyst class. You know, you're the smart guys who like to work, who love to be here, especially on a hot day. No desire to go home. Even willing to come to a boring lecture in the middle of the day just to kind of prolong things, right? You know, the symbolic analysts are of course the cultural driving force for a lot of developments in the culture. And sociologists study them and find out, well, they actually love what they do. In many cases, they don't mind the long hours. That's what they love to do. I think of college professors as potentially being in this class. If we could just get rid of our students, it'd be great. You know, but we have to grade all those papers. Then when you start grading the papers, you don't love it anymore. But There is a school of thought that feels that there's a danger of some sort of cyber elite taking over, that the world will be run by the high technicians. H.G. Wells suggested this as early as a novel written called When the Sleeper Wakes, which is before World War I. So there's a lot of people who have worried about this. I argue in the book, I don't think that's what's happening at all. I think I see actually more and more differentiation in this area, just as I did in the area of consumer spending, or the whole thing about becoming more of the same or more different. So I don't really think there's a cyber elite out there. But I raise the issue because that's part of this whole conundrum. But basically, where we are with work seems to be that we're having more and more work instead of the reduction which we thought we were going to get with high technology. We seem to be working more. Whether we're enjoying it less or more, I don't know. But that's the situation. The 8th chapter takes up a different issue. How do we shape, is the market going to choose the technologies? How do we decide what ones we should have and how we should have them? And this is a real thorny issue. I think a lot of people who are in business, their first response will be, well, yeah, of course the market should decide. But I'll give you a couple examples. You may back off from that sort of real laissez-faire fundamentalism if you have that approach. Take the issue of cloning. Right now there's some company that offers to clone, if you have a dying cat, they'll make a clone of your cat so that you can have an identical animal to the one that you had before, or an identical dog or whatever. And there's very few controls over this. And part of me says, well, I guess it doesn't really matter. People want to spend their money like this instead of going and getting a cat almost for free. I spend thousands of dollars. But there isn't much control over it, apparently. If it's human cloning, there'd be all sorts of control. But if they want to, clone a cat, apparently there's not. I think the company was called Savings and Clone, but I may be wrong. But take a more serious example. You'll probably follow this in the news, right? Vioxx, the drug which part of the pressure from drug companies was, well, we have to get these things approved more quickly so our patients out there can get these drugs. They need them. And so Vioxx was rushed through a little too fast, we now know. And there are all sorts of lawsuits, people saying, well, my husband or father or whoever died, had problems. I mean, we do actually, when it comes to drugs, we kind of like a little bit of regulation. If you just had the free market with no regulation, I think all of us would become uncomfortable in that area. How about living to 1,000? Do you know about this? Aubrey de Grey, the researcher at Cambridge University, who thinks it's prolonging life is an engineering problem. We just got to replace defective cells and defective parts, and you can keep going. And he sees no real reason why we couldn't live potentially maybe even 5,000 years, maybe even forever. I thought he was just an isolated case, but a guy who I know is a very intelligent scientist once said to me at dinner in all seriousness, he said, we might be the last generation that has to die. And at first we all think, well, that sounds terrible that I'm the last generation that has to die, but the idea that we maybe wouldn't die, that would be pretty amazing. It would be great. But is it great for a society? What happened? When do we retire? So we're going to live to 1,000, and I suppose I retire tomorrow and then this thing hits and I'm able to live to 1,000. I have 900 and some years of retirement. I don't think that would be maybe so great, but also it would be very hard on the government because they'd be paying out for all those years, right? So obviously that wouldn't work. You'd have to have government get involved at some point to figure out how this is going to work. How are you going to have people live to that long? When would retirement be? What would society then expect of people? How old would the average voter be? Would things become incredibly conservative because everybody wants it still to be like it was in 1980? After 1,000 years, they're still thinking 1980, that was the good time, or 1990 or whatever year it was. So we start to realize that we're getting into the point now where we have such powerful technologies that we're going to have some way of getting a grip on these things and not just letting the market. There is no such thing as the market, really. It is a confluence of political and economic forces. How are we going to deal with this? And I don't have a good answer. I just know it's a real problem. One way you can look at it is either the Congress is going to do it and everybody then thinks, oh, God, we don't want that, Or it could be the corporations to do it. There are lots of examples I can give you of the Congress screwing up, but I'm going to take it on faith that you all have examples in your own minds, and we'll move beyond that. And there are examples of corporations screwing up too, but there's a deeper problem, which is if you're going to have the electorate involved in this, what kind of information do they have? And unfortunately, the press doesn't cover technology all that well. They tend to cover it on the business pages as an investment question. But there's not a lot of good writing about science and technology in your average newspaper. Television is pretty much not covering it. The level of knowledge in the general population, if you want them to vote on something, is probably not where we would like it to be. Now, it used to be we had a solution for this. We had a thing called the Office of Technology Assessment, which was defunded, which is an interesting word. They killed it, but they called it defunding it in the 1990s. There was a group of people who prepared reports on the request of members of Congress. The problem was that they weren't very compliant. They tended to send back reports sometimes saying, this is a bad idea, or this is going to lose money, or this has really got all these objections, which is not what these congressmen wanted. You know, they wanted a report to justify their particular project. They wouldn't have asked about it otherwise. So they tend, in other words, you don't get rewarded for that sort of behavior of being critical. Now, but other countries picked up on it. So the Germans and the English and a lot of other countries said, this is a good idea. And they have offices of technology assessment now, trying to give their legislatures some informed, balanced opinion, you know, not biased by any particular lobby group or anything, but just trying to say, well, here are the options we see, here are the possibilities. But we don't have that. So that, at least at the moment, that's not going to be an option for the United States. Another way of doing it, though, is deliberative polling. I don't know if any of you have heard of this, but it's not just a theory. It's actually been used, and I think it's a rather fascinating one. Oh, going too fast. I've got a picture there of a big polluting-looking power plant because deliberative polling was used in Texas. There was a utility that wanted to add several megawatts of power because, of course, Texas population is growing and there's more and more demand. They'll have air conditioning down there. And so they decided, we'll try this. Deliberative polling means that you get a representative sample of a group. In this case, it was their customer base. And they did really try to get a representative group. And then they presented them the problem. We want to have more power generation. We got to have this. You got to have this. How should we do it? You know, they presented the nuclear option, the, you know, coal, gas, oil, alternative energies. And they got experts in, and they spend about a week staying in a conference center and getting all the various positions presented. The goal is they're not a jury. They're not like to come out with the answer. But they're supposed to at least come out with some recommendations. And the interesting thing that came out of this was that the group of people there in the end decided that weighing all the various factors, they preferred wind energy. And that's what they did. In oil, Texas, right? Texas was the last place you think that they would come up with it. But they found out that, well, people were more comfortable with that. And they said, well, it's not going to raise the utility bill very much because it's balanced out with all the other things we're doing, you know, all the other ways of making energy. So, and they built it. So that was a way of, okay, there's some democratic consultation going on. Also, by the way, probably saved them a lot of lawsuits and slowing the thing down, which you would have had if you just try to do this, environmental impact statements and all kinds of ways, groups can prevent something from happening. So that would be one way maybe of solving this problem, of keeping people in the loop a little bit, and not just assuming it should be done entirely in the boardroom, but maybe not letting Congress get its hands on it either. So, but I don't have the absolute solution, but it's the best I could find. Greater security. Now this is another thing that as we get more and more powerful technologies, we sometimes have tremendous destructive results. I have a picture of the Chicago fire in 1871 because that was a fire that burned down the whole city. And that used to happen with some regularity around the world, that cities would just burn down. Now it doesn't happen anymore. This is a good example of, well, we've become better. We know how to build cities. We know how to build buildings so they don't burn down as often. We have better fire departments. We've learned how to do this. So in one sense you can say, well, yeah, obviously we're doing better. But aside from that, there's also a whole issue of accidents. And you could say, well, there again, we're doing better. It used to be steam engines would blow up and the whole steamboat everybody be scalded to death and blasted off into the air. That doesn't happen because we understand metal fatigue and we have an understanding of how to put pressure gauges on that will blow off, the safety devices and all this. So in some sense, you could just come up with a good answer. Yeah, it's working, it's good. But the problem is, as you get more and more systems, and I'm sure you've run into this in software design, you put together various bits of some different technologies, each of which works fine by itself, but there's some incompatibility when you put them together. I see a few people nodding their heads. You know how this can happen. I mean, it happened, for example, with airplane design. There was a DC-10 that had a problem that the one door tended to depressurize. But this was back in the 60s. When that happened, it affected a lot of things. I won't go into all the details, but it made the floor buckle a little bit. And that tended to ruin the ability to steer the plane. There were some electrical cables that went through there. So there was a whole series of different technologies involved here, and it was just this one small thing. The best example, though, would be the Challenger disaster, where they've got, I mean, how many thousands of parts in this thing? They're all working, but the O-ring, this inexpensive rubber ring, a sealer, doesn't function in cold weather. And it was a very cold day when they tried to launch the Challenger, and so it blew up. And that's an example of what you can call it disaster incubation. That is that there are lots and lots of parts, lots and lots of things, all of which work independently okay, but when you put them all together, there are a lot of little things that could go wrong, and you can, in a sense, you're incubating a disaster, a possible disaster will come along. Another example would be the way that we try to control forest fires. This is now a natural example, or a human-natural interface. We keep, the fires from breaking out, and what happens? You accumulate more and more stuff to burn. There's more and more leaves and branches and dry stuff on the ground, and eventually when you do get a fire, it's a worse fire than if you had not done this. So it's a sort of ironic situation. You're incubating a disaster. I'm not sure if this applies to Katrina in New Orleans. That might just be downright incompetence. I don't know. But weapons, though, take up a lot of this chapter. I look at the whole history of the development of weapons, and I don't have time to do it here today. But I'll just point out an interesting paradox. That as the weapons get better and better, and also the medicine dealing with soldiers gets better and better, what happens is fewer soldiers are dying, but more and more civilians are dying. And the turning point is actually World War II. Up till World War II, most of the people dying in wars were soldiers. But now it's got to the point where 90% or more of those who die in wars are civilians. Because they've gotten pretty good. I mean, the technologies are functioning, right? It's too hard to bomb the other soldiers, so you bomb the civilians instead. So you could say, well, that's a sort of paradoxical result. It's not really safer for us as civilians. But I'll move on to that. The paradox that I come up with in the chapter is that each individual device is probably safer, and it's working better and better. But then we have these unforeseeable dangers, these things that come when you put together 3 or 4 technologies, or 5 or 10 or 100, each of which was developed independently, and now they're all in one big system. And there's the incubation of little disasters which we can't foresee. So it's almost an impossible thing to solve, but that, I think, is the way it is. That there will probably be fewer disasters, but the disasters could potentially be very large. Well, the last chapter, expanding consciousness or encapsulation. What am I talking about here? Well, I got this image of this seal just to kind of get you thinking a little bit. So here's a seal with some headphones on listening to I don't know what. But that seal, in a way, is a little bit like what's happened with human beings, is that we've moved farther and farther away from our natural environment. And are we expanding our consciousness when we, for example, hear whales singing, which we can now do? They can put microphones underwater, and that's really quite amazing. If you haven't listened, I'm very glad I've heard that. So that's an example of what, yeah, we're expanding. We know more. Our minds are, in a sense, stretched by this kind of thing. Or that when we send a Explorer satellite off and we get images back we could never see. So in some ways you can make a case that, yeah, sure, it's definitely getting better. But then there's the other possibility that maybe this seal, if he spent a lot of time wearing headphones, would be encapsulated in technology after a while. In a sense, we're like in an envelope, completely surrounded by technology. And we, in fact, not content with one, we want to multitask. So we're involved in many systems at once, so that you're distracted from one thing to another, but you're all inside the technological envelope the whole time. There are a lot of philosophers who worry about this. Martin Heidegger is the big name one associates with this kind of worry. They're worried about things like the naturalization of technology, the things which you're born to know. That's when as a child, you're born into the world and you know certain things. He said, well, that's natural. So a child born today takes it absolutely for granted that they can fly in an airplane. They don't think about that, for example. So the technology has changed, in a sense, what we think is normal. They change what we think is natural to the point that, in a sense, this seal, or you could think of us walking around wearing our headphones, after a while we think that's normal, not to really see the world around us or hear the world around us because we're so encapsulated. So that's the worry. There was a story that took this up very early called The Machine Stops, which is an astonishing story. I think anybody working for Microsoft would find this quite interesting. It was published before World War I, so it seems very far back, but it looks like a description of the world of the Internet. Has anybody ever seen this story? You've seen that? A couple of people. I mean, of course, it doesn't imagine everything about it, but it's quite an astonishing piece of work. And basically what he finds is that in this world of the future is that everybody is so engrossed in this world of what we would now call the Internet, that they don't go out. They all just stay in their own individual little tiny apartments. And the world's become homogeneous everywhere, so there's no really any attraction to traveling somewhere else. They all just stay home. And these sort of underground places. Anyway, have a look. But that'd be the worst fear of encapsulation. Yeah.
That's kind of like related to what you said at the beginning, where they predicted what PC could be used for.
Yes, right.
Created.
Yes, right. Maybe they were right, those first guys. They just saw too far into the future. But there's this notion in technology that comes out at sometimes, in a way what we're doing is eliminating the resistance of the world. The easy way to get a sense of what this means is if you have to build a fire, and we've all probably done this, you go to the cabin or someplace and you have to cut wood and build the fire yourself to keep warm, you have a very strong sense of what you're doing and how you're keeping warm in your relationship to these materials. But if it's a room like this with climate control and no windows, in a sense, we're cut off and we don't think about how the room is being kept cool. It's just become something automatic as part of the background. And we've eliminated then the world as a kind of resistance to us. We don't have to think about that it's hot because we've just kind of eliminated that. That phrase comes from a novel by Max Frisch called, what is it called? Homo Faber, an early book, obviously influenced by Heidegger. Very interesting book in which the main character is an engineer doing things like, putting in electrical plants in South America. But you can have a look at that sometime maybe. But the question really comes down to then, do you see nature as a kind of a resource, like a standing reserve of things to grab hold of and just do what we want with, or is it a source of wonder? Is it something that we should think of as just raw materials, or is it got some intrinsic value that we should be cherishing? Last thing here is kind of related. At the end of that chapter, I get into this whole issue and say, well, maybe Heidegger's old hat. Maybe Heidegger's not what it's about now. It just looks like nostalgia to worry about being in touch with nature, because we're kind of moving to this new stage where people plus computers are going to be something else, like maybe multiple personalities. There's a whole discussion about maybe it's normal now to have several personalities online. That would not have been, Freud would not have bought this, You're not going to sell this to Freud or Jung that, you can have a very multiple kind of sense of who you are. But now there are people like Sherry Turkle who are seriously talking about this. Another possibility is that maybe we somehow merge into some sort of group mind. That was Howard Rheingold is very keen about this. If any of you have read Howard Rheingold, he's excited about that idea. But also Freeman Dyson's written about the idea. Maybe we could merge with other species. Maybe we could construct technologies that would allow us to communicate with, bats or whales or whatever, various species. Another possibility is artificial intelligence. In a sense, maybe we would migrate into the computer. Lots of science fiction with that sort of an emphasis. Of course, there's the cyborg, the combination, or all of the above. Or I have one image here from a satirical magazine called The Onion. See if you recognize who we have here. It's Stephen Hawking. He's done some, he's been talking about some of these issues, so they were having a little fun with him. But Hawking, of course, is a person who almost exists now completely as a mind having to use all these devices to communicate with the rest of us, a very brilliant man. So that at the end of that chapter, I'm really saying, well, maybe Heidegger was asking the wrong question because we moved to a totally new cultural situation. And that gives us this whole question of technology in the future. And I really have very little to say. This is the conclusion, which to some extent is a summary with new examples of what I've talked about here today. But one possibility is Arthur Clarke once put it, he said the machine is going to take over. He saw the natural development of evolution was going to be that human beings would be replaced by machines. And he pretended at least, maybe he really felt it, that this was okay. Didn't bother him. But I would argue that we have lots of choices. When he talks like that, it sounds like fate. It's just going to happen. But I think we have choices. I think we've had choices for the last 100,000 years, and we still will have choices in the future. And there's not just one future then. There's many possible futures, some of them not so appealing. And that's why I wrote the book, because I think that we have to think about these questions and realize that technology matters for all sorts of reasons. These 10 are the ones that seem most important to me, but there are no doubt others that would seem important to you. And the future is not predictable, of course. There's the monorail that was going to transform the transportation system here in Seattle. Right now it's under construction. I was hoping to ride it, but it's not operating right now. Are they building one to the airport, perhaps? But it's the end of my presentation then, and I hope that some of you will have questions. I'm glad some of you felt free to interrupt as we went along. Yes?
So at the beginning of the lecture, you had mentioned I guess society has more or less tied electronic technology and technology together.
Right.
Where do you think we are on the technological scale, or I guess throughout history, the timeline? Where do you think technology kind of sits from the perspective of identifying other technologies that are non-electrical, like you'd mentioned the lever and the wheel and all of that sort of thing? Are we at the end of that, and pretty much everything from here is going to be somewhat electronic in nature?
Well, it's an interesting question. The book I wrote some years ago, Electrifying America, kind of was trying to talk about that whole issue, how the world changed in a sense when people began to adopt electricity, which is, for practical terms, if you don't count the telegraph, the first really widespread use of it is not until the 1870s and 80s. So I think you can see a major shift is going on, that people are making these choices at that time. But yeah, for most of human history, the power you had available until the steam engine, or what was basically from very much natural forces or muscle power, all the way up, to at least the time. The American Revolution, there's 2 steam engines in the United States, only 2, and they're both pumping water. So if you think of it in U.S. terms, we are basically muscle and wind power up until sometime in the early 19th century, which is, I think most people don't realize that. It's been very recent. We've had 200 years of being a high energy society. It's not that long. So we're still learning. We're still figuring it out. I don't know if that quite answers your question, but I think there has been a...
It sounds like we're farther, we're more on the cusp of the edge. In other words, we haven't had a lot of history with...
Yeah. We haven't really explored where the limits might be to the resource base for this kind of society either. We're just using up the resources at a great rate right now. I don't actually take the pessimist view on this. I think we probably can, as long as we look ahead and see the problems before they completely overwhelm us. I think we actually can make electricity other ways. We can do many things. So I'm not here as a doomsayer, but I'm not here as a cheerleader either. I'm trying to sort of be in the middle and raise the questions and make people think about them. Yes?
Did that floor buckle a little bit on the DC-10, or it exploded? If you have 1 atmosphere above the floor and 0 atmosphere.
No, it really it buckled, yeah. And that,
Just buckled?
as I understood it buckled, but But I mean, all I know is it ruined the pilots. Didn't just lose the pressure; they lost the ability to.
They lost all the cables.
Yeah, that's right. They lost the cables. They couldn't.
Also, check out the spelling of Forster.
Oh, is there 2 R's and 1 R?
It's O-R-S-T-E.
Okay, I'll look. But yeah, but that's quite possible that. But I didn't explode in the sense I don't think of the plane disintegrating. I don't.
But all
Yeah.
the cables ran to the floor.
Yes.
There was 1 atmosphere on top of it, half an atmosphere below it.
Yeah.
You know, an atmosphere is a kilogram per square centimeter.
Yeah. So there's tremendous.
Rest.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, another example of one of these disasters that's unforeseeable was when they had all this problem with the theater fires and they put asbestos in. That seemed like the best technological solution at the time, only to discover later on that that causes cancer. It's like it wasn't anybody's intent.
Right, we'll go ahead and wrap up. If you guys
Okay.
have further questions, please feel free to stick around. Doctor and I will be around for a little while. And enjoy your afternoon. Thank you very much.
Okay.
That was fantastic.
Oh, thanks.
The civilian casualties in the Second War